Hi everyone, my name is Ashley. I hope everyone is continuing to have a wonderful semester so far. Today I'll be talking about Valentin Paredes' article, Burning Bridges, Why Don't Organized Crime Groups Pull Back from Violent Conflicts? I have analyzed this article in order to answer the question, what is the role of violence in organized crime? This article highlights what many people believe to be the main role for organized crime and emphasizes that perhaps the real reason is much deeper than what may seem. Let's dive into this a little bit. Also, a quick disclaimer, I apologize if I mispronounce any of the names mentioned in this presentation. I will try my very best to get as close to the actual pronunciation as possible. I have created a little agenda for us today just so we can see how this presentation is going to be structured and what I'm going to be talking about. So to begin, I have decided to talk about the main theory regarding the role of violence in organized crime. Then, just as the article does, I will talk about organized crime groups in Mexico and how violence drastically has increased due to these groups crossing the line. I'll talk more about what that means in a moment. I will then mention the two groups that are highlighted most in this article and then explain exactly how these groups epitomize the point that Parita is explaining in the article. I've also found an example that relates the issue directly back to us in Canada, which is a double homicide of two Canadians that took place in Mexico. Lastly, I will just be relating everything I have mentioned back together and asking you guys a few questions just to get your input. So let's get started. Parita first mentions that in many different theories, it is thought that violence is used in organized crime solely for the purpose of financial cost effectiveness. I know what you're thinking. Ashley, what does that mean? It means that this theory posits organized crime groups will take part in violence with other groups or law enforcement simply because they want to maintain their territories, drug sales, and other illegal activities, all due to the fact that they want to maintain their financial gains. While this may be a large part of why violence is committed, the article explains that the real role of violence in organized crime groups is to maintain their own status, power, and most emphasized, their safety. Once these groups have committed a certain level of violence, which may vary, they may cross a threshold in which Parita calls the point of no return. This point happens when an organized crime group commits multiple heinous violent acts and has to continue demonstrating their capabilities. If they somehow decrease the number of violent acts they take part in, they may lose their power, their territories, their finances, but as I mentioned earlier, they may lose their safety. If word gets out that they are becoming less violent, they could easily become targets for other groups to overpower them. In addition, law enforcement may feel that they are less of a threat and find them easier to detain. Therefore, many groups find themselves burning bridges. This, as mentioned in the article, means to take measures in order to make retreat impossible for themselves and whoever they're pining against. Do you know when you tell a little white lie to someone and it spirals into this huge lie that you now have to keep telling? Perhaps this is how organized crime groups see their violent acts. They commit a small one and then continue to be so violent that they just can't stop. And just like that, hit the point of no return. Ultimately, it's important to recognize that after organized crime groups have crossed this point, the role of violence shifts from just financial gain to overall safety. So, the article talks about specifically organized crime groups in Mexico and how violence is extremely prevalent within these groups. Parita delves into the topic of two groups specifically, La Familia Michoacana and Los Caballeros Templarios. Again, I sincerely apologize for my pronunciation. These two groups are or were active around the Michoacan region of Mexico, and This region has experienced heightened violence due to territorial disputes and other competition from organized crime groups. With these groups operating in Michoacan, in 2011, this region became one of the most dangerous regions for federal and military personnel. Again, this violence is used by organized crime groups for both financial gain and their so-called safety once the initial bout of violence is committed. Let's talk about each of these two groups as highlighted in the article. La Familia Michoacana is one of the main groups mentioned in the article. This group heavily relied on increasingly violent acts. At first, they boasted that they were not focused on killing. Rather, their business was their main priority. The article mentions a quote from a former member that explains their rules, saying, "It is forbidden to fire guns, it is forbidden to kill, and it is prohibited to drive over the speed limit or under the influence of alcohol." What do you think? Does that sound like a group that commits heinous acts of violence? Yet these rules were intended mainly to get support from outside sources. This group sustained substantial human and financial losses due to the violent acts they committed. In the early 2000s, 2006 to be exact, La Familia Michoacana tossed five decapitated heads onto a club dance floor. But they aren't killers, right? Even this is not yet where they cross the line. This group was thought to be the second law in the Michoacan region of Mexico. I mean, their name pretty much implies that. They would do things like, as the article states, going after petty criminals, treating addicts, keeping drugs out of the local markets, and protecting people from other criminal organizations. Again, this is just the public face that they wanted to portray rather than being known for the terrifying acts that they commit on the sidelines. After their nightclub visit in 2006, it was seen that this group was a contributing factor to the normalization of heightened forms of brutality. By this, I mean that decapitation by organized crime groups became more prominent, as well as torture and mutilation. In fact, Parita explains that these acts became so prevalent that new members were trained to do them even before they went on the streets. La Familia Michoacana finally crossed the line, however, when they started to target law enforcement. This is when they knew in order to maintain their safety as a criminal organization, they were to continue committing violent crimes. Ultimately, this group began to deteriorate as many of their members were either lost after being involved in these violent acts or being detained by law enforcement officials. This is where our next group comes into play. Los Caballeros Templarios is the second group highlighted in this article. This group came to be after the downfall of La Familia Michoacana. In fact, many of the leaders and members of this new group had come from La Familia Michoacana, and therefore the violent acts that were being committed just happened to continue. This group also lost many of their members because of this violence. Los Caballeros Templarios was predicted to cease to exist as well, due to the fact that their increasingly violent acts had drawn the police right to them. So, how do these two groups exemplify the role of violence in organized crime groups? Simply, they have passed the point of no return. They have committed such violent acts, and they continue to increase the violence, that in order for them to maintain their structure as a group, they saw violence as the only option. The role of violence, as I mentioned earlier, is not only to maintain the group's financial gain, but to deter other organized crime groups and law enforcement from, quote unquote, messing too much with their business. These two groups absolutely highlight exactly what the role of violence is in organized crime groups, at least through the eyes of those involved in organized crime. I actually found an example that pretty closely relates to this topic, in that in mid-January of this year, There was a double homicide that took place in Playa del Carmen. The Toronto Star explains this incident in depth. There were 3 victims total, the 3rd victim not being seriously wounded. And this actually ties this right back to our country, as the victims were Canadians. The article I had found mentions that Mexican beach resorts are rattled by organized crime violence lately. This attack was not the first of its kind to happen recently. The article actually lists 12 additional homicides with similar circumstances within recent years. This most recent double homicide ties directly into Canada's organized crime, as the victims were said to have criminal pasts. Actually, the first victim was even thought to be an alleged member of the Hells Angels, the outlaw motorcycle group that I talked about in my previous presentation. I personally found this very interesting, as this is just further proof that to this day there are extremely violent acts taking place with Mexico's organized crime groups, as well as Canada's organized crime groups. For this example specifically, I found in the article that the Hells Angels actually had a clubhouse in Playa del Carmen. That just has to be pure irony, right? I didn't think so either. There have been multiple reports of territorial disputes, as mentioned in the news article, between multiple different organized crime groups in this region. It is also heavily implied that these disputes may be the reason for many of the murders of Canadians in Mexico in recent years. This violence, though it started as being solely for the territory and consequential financial gain, has turned into almost a necessity for these groups to maintain the safety of their organization. I find it fascinating that this is how organized crime groups operate, as if the violence doesn't make them more of a target. It's a vicious cycle for them, and as Parita emphasizes, they diminish their own existence by doing so. So, how does this example tie in with the article? Well, I believe that it is a great way of showing the role that violence plays in organized crime groups. Not only that, but it shows how prominent this truly is in multiple countries, as the first article solely mentions Mexico. These groups commit violent acts because they are told it is absolutely necessary to do so. They must deter other organized crime groups and law enforcement from getting too close to their illegal activities, and this example shows that. Seeing that it was likely members from organized crime groups in Canada impeding on the territory of a group from Mexico, the members resorted to violence to maintain their own safety. So I just wanted to conclude this presentation by ensuring the most important aspects of this article are expressed once again. Parita highlights in depth that although many theorists believe violence is committed by organized crime groups solely for the purpose of being cost-effective, it should also be emphasized that these groups may be involved in violence to maintain their own safety overall. Once an organized crime group has burned their bridges, they must continue to commit violent acts because they have no way of exiting that situation. They're forcing other groups or law enforcement officials to not retreat, and therefore they must not retreat either. All in all, the role of violence in organized crime is to maintain safety, power, and financial status within one's own group. Now, I just have a couple of quick discussion questions for you guys, and it would be greatly appreciated if you would let me know your thoughts and your answers. So first, what do you think is the actual role of violence in organized crime? Is it for cost effectiveness, or due to burned bridges, or maybe even both? And second, do you think there is a chance for the groups who have passed the point of no return to decrease the number of violent crimes they commit? Why or why not? Please let me know what you guys think. I would like to thank you guys for watching my presentation, and I really hope you enjoyed it. And once again, here's just a list of my references. Thank you again for watching. I wish you luck with all of your presentations and with the remainder of your semester. Thanks again, guys.